A warm welcome to this online event of the Moyan International Writing Center at Regent's Park College. Winning Words, students discuss their creative writing process. In keeping with that title, we have on our panel today the three winners and one of the judges from last year's Oxford BNU Creative Writing Award. Megan Chester, studying on the MST Creative Writing course, claimed first prize with her short story, Girl, Woman, River, a remarkable piece of sports fiction blending rowing and theology, beautifully shaped and voiced. Ellen Taylor, undertaking a DPhil in experimental psychology, took runner-up with Stella Polaris, a story inspired by her love of wild swimming and possessed with mythical resonance and a devastating climax. And Rowan Curtis, previously a DPhil student and now a postdoc in planetary physics, also took runner-up and continued the watery theme with his allegorical piece, The Most Beautiful Ship in the World, a swashbuckling read, but with very dark undercurrents. Leading the discussion is Dr. Lynn Robson, tutorial fellow in English literature and dean at Regent's Park College, where she is also tutor for admissions for English and joint director of studies for BA honors in classics and English. On top of all those hats, Lynn is again on the judging panel for this year's award. The panel will chat for about 40 minutes, after which we will turn over to questions and answers. So please do put your questions and comments into the chat box or raise your hand when we get to that point. I'll just mention that at some points you might see speakers' screens go black because we are saving bandwidth for them to have a better audio connection depending on their location. But with that technical point out of the way, I will now hand over to you, Lynn, please.
Thank you so much, Louise. That's great. And just to add my thanks to Megan and Rowan and Ellen for joining us today. I hope you're looking forward to this conversation just as much as I am. So I just thought, let's start with your stories, because I know that the people who are attending will probably want to know a lot more about your stories from their intriguing titles. So why don't we just begin with each of you? Perhaps Megan, you could start with just talking a bit about your story, explain what it was about. Just sort of briefly introduce your story as a starting place. Megan, over to you.
Absolutely, yeah. So my story, it was a short collection of short stories called Girl, Woman, River, and it sort of combined the themes of rowing and sport more generally, specifically female athletes and women in sport, with exploring prayer and belief in God and creation, and for me all these things sort of are very interlinked and sort of go together, and so it's sort of wound them all together, and it basically followed the experiences of a girl called Amy, and she starts at university and is struggling in various ways, and sort of finds sport, finds rowing, finds the community that goes with it, but then also learns a lot about herself through that, and of her faith in God through that, and it sort of follows her ups and downs. So that's a little bit about it. I tried to make it kind of funny in parts and quite difficult and sad in parts, and just capture the reality of what sport is often like. It can be great and it can be absolutely really taxing as well in different ways. So the short stories tried to sort of capture that.
Thanks, Megan. And before we move on to Rowan, I would say one of the things that all of the judges really appreciated about the entries for last year's prize was just the diversity of the stories. A range of lengths, a range of subjects and topics, of styles. It was just one of the most enriching things about being a judge. Having, it was an immense privilege in, being one of the judges to to be able to read all of these stories. So Rowan, over to you. Talk a little bit about your story, and because it's very different. It was very different from Megan's.
Yeah, and actually very different from anything I've written otherwise.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. So the most beautiful ship in the world takes the form of a message in the bottle from this character who has lived their whole life on a nondescript ship in the middle of the ocean. So I actually have the original handwritten copy of it here, which I tried to make look like paper that had come from the ship. And this character loves the ship he lives on, and because of various reasons, the world he loves slowly is dismantled and becomes not what he signed up for, if you will, not what he's used to. And there's a slow degradation of the world he loves. And just in tandem to that, it's slowly becoming harder for him to leave. And the ship begins in a sort of semi-real description of the world. And then at some point, there's a turning point from which fantastical elements come into play, and nature itself starts reacting to the characters on the ship. And yeah, I guess I should stop there. But
yeah, I was interested when you said a nondescript ship, because one of the things I remember most vividly about your story is the way that you were able to communicate that ship. Yes, I think of it actually as
very tangible.
Yeah, very tangible. Yeah, indeed. So it's really interesting. Thank you. Ellen, tell us about Stella Polaris.
Yeah, so the first thing is apologies, I am on a train at the moment. I hope that you can all hear me okay, but I'm gonna had a reshuffle of plans last minute. That means unfortunately I'm gonna have to sit here and talk in the carriage, so I'm really sorry if my connection goes. But Stella Polaris is a piece about reflecting on childhood memories primarily. It's also about dealing with trauma, and one of the things that I wanted to explore was the kind of bridge between real life memories of childhood and kind of magic and fantasy and magical realism. So I wanted to kind of explore the ambiguity of kind of what's real and what's not when we remember our childhoods, and it's very easy to kind of think of things through rose-tinted spectacles and have these beautiful memories, but also there can be lots of darkness, lots of trauma and grief underneath. Yeah, so that's what it was about for me. It was my first time writing a short story, so that was definitely challenging for me, but I absolutely loved writing it, and hopefully that came through in the writing.
Thank you. Can I just pick up on what you said there? I mean, yeah, your first go at writing a short story and you win a prize, which is really encouraging for anybody who's listening who may be thinking about entering but might be a little bit worried about doing so because they haven't got the experience. I think that's wonderful. But you also talked about it challenged you, and I just thought it would be interesting for everybody if we take some time just to explore in conversation that form of the short story, and how you approach it. Is it different from if you're thinking, how do you think about it? How do you begin to do it? But particularly, perhaps we'll start with the challenges of a short story. Ellen, if you don't mind, could you just expand on that a little bit and think about and talk about what was challenging for you when you came to write it?
Yeah, so I usually write much longer pieces. I think I wouldn't call myself a novelist because it takes so long to write a novel, but that's kind of my more comfortable pace of writing. So I think the challenge for me was prioritizing which parts would go into a short story and kind of dealing with the very different rhythms. I found it difficult at times. I had to do a lot of editing down to kind of get it into the word length. So I think for me that was the most challenging part, to kind of create a story that does feel complete and does kind of have all of the tension and drama that I would usually want to put into a longer piece, yet is still very, very short in its actual words.
Okay, so yeah, that's great. So actually kind of thinking about how you would tell that story and put your concept into within the word limit. Yes, it was for you that kind of reduction of and compression of narrative as well. Would that be right? I think we may have lost Ellen for a moment. So Rowan, yeah, talk to us about the challenges of that you came across in writing The Most Beautiful Ship in the World.
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of the short story, and have written lots of realistic fiction short stories, usually shorter than this. And I also tackled a novel within which you have so much more space to do what you want to do. I suppose the best short stories that I enjoy are usually those which are minimalist, and which I think you couldn't take out a single sentence or word from this without it taking away from the story. But the challenge for me with this short story was that I had decided at some point, and I think it was because of what was happening in the world at the time when I was writing it, it was the middle of the pandemic, I decided I'd become more interested in world building. And I really wanted to write a short story in which I built a world which felt tangible, etc., but still was minimalist. And how do you build a world quickly in 5,000 or 6,000 words, and then still allow your story to become about something? So I think that whenever I read stories, there comes a point, whatever length it is, when the story has become about something. And George Saunders uses the "is it soup" analogy from that Heinz advert. You know, is it soup yet? We're asking ourselves, is it story yet? And all great short stories, for me, become about something at a moment. And that could be near the beginning, or it could be right at the end. It can happen in the last few sentences. So for me, the challenge was to keep within this minimalist frame, build a world, and still allow it to become about something. And it took a lot of smashing away at a piece of marble. I think originally it ended up at about 11,000 words, and I chopped it into about 6,000, 7,000.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And was that the same for you, Ellen? Was it, how long was, when you said it was too long and you had to edit it down? I mean, what kind of length was it in your first draft, and what kind of length did it finish up at?
So I ended up writing about half of my storyline, and it was hitting the maximum amount of words. So I ended up stopping halfway through and kind of editing it down before I continued, because it was making me very stressed. But yeah, it was very difficult for me to do that, but also a really interesting experience. I'm kind of challenging myself.
Right. Yeah. Good. Megan, was yours a similar experience, or have you a different story to tell?
Yeah, no, there's I guess definitely just similarities with the sort of, I empathize with the kind of word count being a bit of a trial at times, and wanting to sort of write beyond it. But I think actually the having to cut the stories or the series of short stories, or the one short story down, it's quite an important refining process, because actually in the first draft my stories were way over the word limit, but a lot of it wasn't necessary, and actually that being forced to cut it down then made it better. And it was I find, so I haven't really, short stories isn't my sort of background or my comfort zone within writing. I write more poetry, and so I hadn't really written many before. I hadn't read that many short stories before, but my dad used to make up the short stories and write short stories for my brother and I, and my brother and me, and so I love short stories and think that they're really sort of forms in which you can get a lot in a short space of time, and like Rowan was saying, that kind of when they're done well, you get that sort of world building satisfaction in a very short space of time, which can be really rewarding. But I do find the difficult thing for me is communicating character in such a short space of time. So you want your reader to care about this character, but you only have X number of pages or X number of words to make sure that they do. And so I guess that was one of the challenges for me, one, sort of getting used to writing in that form, even though it's a form I love, like actually sort of having a go at it myself. And I guess my way of doing that was actually to bring quite a lot of poetry into it. So I brought bits of like prose poetry into it, and sort of blurring the boundaries between short stories and poetry, and letting them all sort of entangle a little bit. And then also just trying to work on this character and get to know this character. And I hoped that if I felt like I knew her, then maybe other people would get to know her quickly as well, and be able to care about her and what she cares about. Yeah.
Did you have any specific techniques for building character? Because you're right. I mean, that is a challenge, isn't it? In limited amount of words to render a character vividly, but also to, as you say, to make the reader care so that they want to carry on reading. Yeah.
To be honest, the character to begin with was 3 different characters, and she sort of merged into one when I realised I didn't have space for 3 different characters. So I think that kind of compression, I tried to get my reader to care about lots of different people in a very short space of time, and then realised that actually let's just take the bits that of these different characters that seem to or that I hope people would relate to the most, and bring them into this one character so that I can really get to know Amy, and then hopefully other people can really get to know Amy. I think it was that sort of that sort of prioritising and focus, so that I sort of wasn't throwing too many different character traits or too many different characters in general at people.
You've I don't know if this is right. You seem to have hinted a couple of times that you thought of this as a series of stories rather than a single story. Is that right? Did you have a kind of idea of several interlinked stories originally?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, and sort of realized quite early on that actually that wasn't going to work in the word count.
Yeah,
but I was quite glad that happened, because then it enabled me to really sort of sit with this one character and with this one story, rather than trying to sort of do too much in too short a sort of
So what kind of time scale for each of you? How long did it take you to kind of do this? And was there, I'd be interested.
I'm trying to think now, actually. It was funny. I think I'd been thinking about it for a very long time, so it's sort of been in my mind for a long time. The themes, and particularly writing about women in sport, had been something that I'd been wanting to do for a long time. But then I think it was different with different parts of it. So some parts of it, I remember sort of sitting down and just writing out quite quickly in a burst one evening. But then the editing process took longer. So all in all, not including the kind of marinating the themes and things, the actual writing and editing bit, maybe a few months, a good few months of sort of writing and tweaking and writing and tweaking.
Yeah, I'm very familiar with that kind of living with the words in your head all the time. How can you write this? Similar kind of time span, Rowan and Ellen?
A slightly different experience in some ways. Strangely, the idea for the story actually came in April 2021 when I was walking up St Giles, just past Oxfam, about 40 meters away from Regent's. And I've been having certain feelings myself, which are reflected in the main character in the story, but also someone close to me so I was feeling it on a large scale about, well, if you read the story, you'll see what I wanted to write about. But someone very close to me was also in a situation on a local scale in a workplace that this whole world that they loved had just fallen to pieces, and I had this feeling that I wanted to capture, and then the idea came to me about the ship and the basic frame of the story, and then it just sat there in my head for about 3 or 4 months, and then one day in early August 2021, I woke up on Friday morning and realized pretty much everything about the story just arrived in this morning. So I spent the whole weekend writing it, and I started on the Friday morning, and by the Sunday night it was done. So it was a real frenzy for me, and I don't usually write like that. So it just all came out, and then I emerged at the end of the weekend with this, this manuscript, and
wonderful.
no sleep. So.
Yeah. And Ellen, what about you?
Hi, sorry, my signal's cutting in and out.
That's okay. Just
and I didn't catch I didn't catch everything that Rowan said, but I think it sounds like I had a similar experience. In that I knew for quite a long time. So my story is set in the Isle of Jura up in Scotland, and I knew that I wanted that setting for quite a long time. And I had this idea of writing a kind of ghost story or something similar set up in Scotland. So that was brewing in my mind for quite a long time. But then the actual writing process was very short and intense. I think I knew for quite a long time that I wanted to enter something for the competition, but left it quite late to actually sit down and write, and then panicked. So I had lots of long days sat in the library with cups of coffee, and I think probably the initial drafting was
we're just losing you a little bit.
Writing.
Yeah. Thank you, Ellen. Thanks. We just lost the last bit, but I think, it was very clear. Thank you very much. So those were the kind of the challenges. Now let's talk about the delights of the short story. Yes, I as a reader, short stories are delightful. I enjoy reading them. I like the fact that I can kind of absorb a world or a particular, even maybe just a moment or a few moments in a character's story very quite quickly, and I can just sit and read it at a single sitting. So that's me as a reader. But what about the kind of delights of writing short stories? I don't mind. Who would like to start? Who's got something to say about?
Go on, Megan.
Go on, Megan. Talk about the delights of writing short stories.
Delights of short stories. That's a nice thing to talk about.
Yeah.
There are many delights of short stories, I think. And like I say, as a sort of a reader or listener, I think they can be very very satisfying. They're often very tidy. So you have a setup, and then the story happens, and then there's something at the end, like a twist or a really clever last line or something like that, and I find that really satisfying. I'm like, I can sort of see the shape of a short story. I think they're often, maybe because I'm sure that structure is there in novels, but because it's a bigger picture, it's harder to see it quite so clearly. This really sort of tight structure. So I think that's one of that sort of structural thing is one of the delights of a short story. And then I find that quite fun to write, because it sort of feels a little bit like figuring out a puzzle. Like, okay, so how am I going to make this shape work, and what shape do I want it to be, and sort of writing the endings of short stories. I think that's quite. I find that quite fun in this one. But I think another thing that I find delightful about short stories is they remind me of poetry quite a bit in many ways. So how in a poem you want the image that you're writing, the words that you choose to be really specific, because there aren't many of them, because the words are limited. Each one has to really say exactly what you want it to say, and create exactly that image that you want it to sort of create. And I think that's then bringing that into prose is quite fun to sort of ruminate over words and think, which one is really going to convey what I mean, and try and make things quite crisp. And it reminds me quite a bit of Imagist poetry, which uses very, very few words to create something very vivid. And I guess that's the aim with a short story, or with some short stories. And it can be quite a fun challenge to do that, I think.
Yeah. Thank you. Rowan?
I very much agree with what you said, Megan, the efficiency of a short story. And the first word that came to my mind, actually, when you asked the question, Lynn, was puzzle. That writing a short story feels like solving a puzzle. you have this vision about what you're trying to get across, and you know, for a while there's a gap between how it really is experienced and what you want, and it's getting closer and closer by solving the puzzle. But the short stories, they can stay with you for a long time, and it's good practice, I think, writing them, because, you know, the beginning of End of the Affair by Graham Greene is something like, a story has no beginning or end. It just, you know, an author just decides at what point to begin and end, and what snapshot to tell you. And with all our short stories, I was thinking this about Megan's, you know, the choice of where to begin and where to end is very deliberate, and you're choosing this snapshot, and you're choosing when to begin, when to end, maybe when to begin and end again. You know, you can take different shots. And like with our experiences in life, of people, of relationships, of experiences, the length of time you spend in an experience or in a relationship doesn't necessarily always relate to how profound it feels or how much it affects you. And there's a certain beauty to reading a very short story, and some of my favorite ones are just a page or two long, and they stay with you for a long time, and they have a very profound effect. And yeah, there feels something poignant about that. You know, War and Peace is a great novel, but you could probably take out 300 or 400 pages of it and still feel most of the same effects, right?
Yeah.
And I've read short stories that have had just as much effect on me as very long novels, and it feels, you know, more efficient and more beautiful because of its efficiency.
Yeah, thank you. Ellen, what's delightful about short stories for you? I'm not sure. Ellen is still possibly not with us. I hope she'll get a signal back soon. So let's now kind of think, I'm sure people who are listening, are thinking, yeah, how did you do this? You've you're working, writing short stories, but obviously you're also studying at the same time. So how do you manage that balance between the creativity of the short story and also the actual kind of time that it takes to craft these stories, and your academic work, because that's, again, a feature of this prize. We're inviting entrants from people who are working and studying, as well as being writers as well. Megan, so talk to us about that balance. Never an easy balance.
It's a tricky balance to strike. I'm quite lucky in that I'm studying creative writing, so I could so my writing is my work, which still feels sort of, I have to pinch myself that I can call it work. But yeah, so that is good, and helpful in sort of finding that balance. But even still, to be honest, I do find it difficult to sort of find time to sit down and write. So it's the course I'm doing is a part-time course, so I also have a sort of day job as well, and it is a tricky thing to sort of balance it all. And one that, if I'm perfectly honest, I'm still figuring out and working out, and I've got a long way to go yet. But I think one thing that I'm finding helpful at the moment is to try and section off, whenever I can, specific bits of time to say this is sort of sacred time for writing, and I must admit that this is very much an ideal that I'm sort of striving after at the moment, but that is it. When I manage it, it seems really helpful because it just gives that space. I was trying to sort of write in snatches in between meetings and things like that, and sometimes that works, but sometimes I just couldn't get into the headspace, and then I'd have to be out of the headspace again, and it so that's one thing, one sort of approach I found. Another is that I wrote about what I love, what I care about and I'm thinking about anyway, and what I'm doing anyway. So I am a rower, and when I'm not working, I'm usually on a river. So I just used that basically, because it meant that, when my crewmates probably thought I was a bit weird, but when I'm at training, I'm trying to sort of like soak in what does it feel like? How would I describe this in words? And which makes it enjoyable because then I get to write about what I enjoy, but also allowing these different parts of life to meet with one another and mingle with one another, I guess, is a way of trying to balance them as well.
Yeah, was that the kind of assigning time and being very clear about, as you said, you called it sacred time. Yes, as the time when you're going to be writing. Was that more difficult during the pandemic and the lockdown, or was that easier to do?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I think in many ways it was probably more difficult because everything was being done in the same space, whereas now I quite like to be like, right, okay, I'll go to this library or I'll go to this coffee shop or whatever, and sort of a way of sectioning out time can be through space as well. And when everything was being done from my bedroom, it was quite difficult to do that actually. And yeah, I was very lucky in that I have great housemates who were sort of through the pandemic kind of they'd ask me about stories and things like that, because I think another thing is when you're not meeting other people to chat about what you're writing about and get excited about it together, it's hard to keep that momentum going as well. So it was nice that it still got that. But yeah, I think it was harder through the pandemic, but then also lots of time to think, I suppose, and think about what's important and what matters and what did I miss and things like that. And I guess I hadn't really realised this until this moment, but a lot of that kind of comes out in the stories, that things like prayer and things like sport and things that really sort of for me came to I don't know, that they've always been important, but the pandemic just gives time for me to really realise how important they are. Then you can put them onto the page.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I suppose one of the kind of longer term impacts of the pandemic is, for me certainly, is you think about how we inhabit certain spaces. Yes. Or how we kind of come back into certain spaces as well. So yeah, really interesting. Thank you. Rowan, what about you?
Before I answer, could I start by asking Megan another question?
Sure,
Sorry,
go ahead. Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yes.
So one thing I guess I'm interested in with you is, so studying the MST, I think I'm right in saying, but correct me if wrong, that in the MST they encourage you not to write something you're working on at the time and to move into different styles, etc. Right? So for your writing, the short stories which you want to do in your personal life, I'm not sure how much overlap there is, probably a lot, but do you find that the MST and being influenced by talking about writing that is not your own but also not your style, do you feel like there's some separation between what you're working on individually and your course, or do you find that the course is heavily influencing the stuff you're not doing? And more importantly, and my real question is, do you find that affects your style and your voice? And do you find that by studying something quite different from what you're doing and constantly thinking about that, at least part-time, constantly thinking about it, it reinforces your voice? Or do you find that it influences your voice and you find it more difficult to maintain that Meganness within your individual stories?
Yeah, that's a good question. So do just want to check that I've got the question correctly. So do the things that I'm writing for the MST and the things that I'm writing technically not for the MST, how much overlap is there, and do I find the course sort of impacts my voice? So actually I think different people so I'm thinking of different people in my course, and we all seem to approach it quite differently. So I think for me, actually, I sort of see it all as quite a big thing, a big mixture, in that rather than this is stuff for course and this is stuff just for me, actually it's kind of all one. I think I wanted to do the course because I wanted it to help me to develop holistically as a writer and to write more, and so I just sort of allow it all to be part of the same thing. And in terms of my voice, and I found that actually it's been quite liberating being pushed into or encouraged into different forms. And so I've done some screenwriting, which I'd never done before, and I've been able to do things that I have done before, like poetry, but then sort of with tutors who sort of made me look at it in a different way and things like that. But I don't think I found that it's changed my voice. And so often we'll have a group of us from the course will get together and read work together. And across the 2 years, we often remark how, we could, if someone else read it out, you could tell that it's X person's writing, or you could tell that it's theirs, because we get used to people's styles. And if anything, that's just become more vivid in everyone, rather than everyone all starting to sound the same as each other. And so I think, I don't think my voice has sort of been merged or impacted particularly. I think if anything, it's probably encouraged me to kind of refine it and bring it out a little bit more, and try and, there have been times when I've sort of written something and said, I wasn't sure whether to submit this because, I thought maybe I do quite a lot of rhyming poetry, and themes, like the themes in these short stories, and often write about my faith, and sometimes I'm like, I don't know whether how these things are going to be received, but actually most of the time people have said, oh no, write more of that, you can tell from the writing that that's what you enjoy, so write more of it. And I'm like, oh okay, I'll do that then. So actually I think it's been quite encouraging that sometimes I feel like I need to hide my voice a bit more, but actually I instead have realized I can just write in my voice.
Thanks.
Thank you. I mean, just in your story, I felt there was a strong voice, and a subtly strong voice, which is one of my favorite things about it. And so thank you for answering that.
Thank you.
So Rowan, just to, I mean, you've moved the kind
Sorry.
of no, not at all. It's fascinating. I'm not, no. And welcome back, Ellen. We're talking about the relationship between academic work and your writing. And so you kind of, Rowan, you've moved the question on slightly, which is to think about the impact, of your academic work, how it might affect your voice, how it might affect more than just portioning up time, which is always going to be a difficult thing. So maybe that would be the next thing to think about.
So to answer both questions, I for a long time, I mean, people sometimes ask me, how does your physics affect your writing? Or when I say I write, people say, oh, well, you do sci-fi, I really separate my physics brain from my writing brain, except from the fact that I think like the process of writing papers, theses and stuff in physics helps you in your communication in some way and helps you make things as efficient as possible. But really for me, it feels like I have two brains. I have physics head and writing head. And when I'm in one, I'm not ever in the other really. And I need to separate them. Even, if I'll try and just work on one per day, but if I'm doing both in the same day, I need some time between, or I need to go for a run or something to clear my head of one. And I think that, like you said earlier about the pandemic, for me, it was really important to have that time and space to be able to create a routine which really focused on these two aspects of my life. Because I finished my PhD just 2 months ago, and I was writing my thesis for a long time, and I was writing a novel in tandem with the PhD, which I started just at the beginning and finished sort of 2.5 years in. And I don't think I would have finished the novel if it wasn't for the pandemic, because what I was doing is in April 2020, I started waking up early in the morning and working on the novel for 2 or 3 hours in the morning, going for a run, having some lunch and doing PhD all in the afternoon. And that helped a lot. And now I have somewhat regular writing patterns, but sometimes still do need to do this enormous splurge in one weekend because the time's not there. But probably like Ellen, I'm always thinking about writing, and it's something I can't not do. I think it's just the way I process my life and the way I experience the world is, if I haven't, sometimes I'll feel like I haven't processed something, and then I'll write about it and it just feels like it's fitted into place now and I can move on from it, and so that's interesting, and I'm interested to see what I write next and processing, in way of processing what's just come. But again, I also think it's really interesting that all of our stories were concerned not just with with things beyond our experience, whether it's gold or fantastical elements or ghosts. But they were also interested in how those elements outside of the real, if you will, in inverted commas, our day-to-day experience affect our lives, and how they influence our situations and our experiences of the world, which is exactly what was happening to us at that period of time when we were writing these stories. And yeah, I think it goes, yeah, sorry, I hope that answers the question.
That's great. No, it's wonderful. Ellen, are you able to answer that question and think about that?
Yeah, I can hear you all, so I hope that you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
I think it's brilliant. Yeah, so I think in terms of timing, I have slightly a more chaotic approach, in that when I feel like I have to write, I need to write, and I like dropping everything, which isn't always the most productive thing to do when you're trying to do a PhD. So I'd say that rather than, I've definitely tried in the past kind of scheduling a day, finding a time of day where I dedicate that time to just writing. And I think that would be a very healthy way to approach it, but for me, that just doesn't work. So my kind of way of scheduling writing and balancing it with my academic work is to just try and stay on top of my academic work as much as I can, so that when I have the urge to write, I won't fall too far behind if I drop the academic work for a day or two and just write. And that really kind of lets me get into the zone a lot more. And I think the kind of second part of that question about thinking about how the academic work influences writing, this has really been a kind of learning curve for me over the last couple of years, because I think, so I'm studying experimental psychology, and my undergraduate was in psychology as well, but I was very nearly an English literature student, and I think in a way I've kind of had a chip in my shoulder in the past about not studying literature and not kind of doing everything I can to help aid my writing. But recently I've definitely had a different perspective of just how creative the sciences can be, and how you can kind of use that different perspective, and the really interesting seminars that you're going to, and the kind of discussions, and allow that to kind of feed into the creative process, which I think is really interesting. Being slightly annoyed about, I have to do psychology and writing, it's really hard to actually thinking, well, my academic study can help me to become a much better writer and puts me in a really good position to
yeah, absolutely, Ellen. I
have that fresh perspective.
Yeah, I think this kind of breaking down of these, well, we know that it's a nonsense, to think that of one writing as creative and a kind of scientific study or some forms of study is not creative. It's the same thing. When I'm talking to my undergraduates, I say all writing is creative. It doesn't. You may be writing an academic essay, it doesn't mean that you can't be creative. And I think that's really important. I'm just aware that unfortunately time is running away with us, as is always the case. So we'll be taking some questions in a few minutes. But I just if you can, I don't know if you can answer this question quite briefly, but I think it would be an interesting way to finish this for people, especially if they're thinking about entering the competition, which is really to think about the significance of the short story today. You've been talking wonderfully about how you've worked through the pandemic and the particular experiences that we've all been having over the last couple of years. But is there anything kind of quite briefly that you'd like to say about the significance of writing and reading short stories today? Megan, why would you like to? Sorry to put you on the spot immediately, but
that's fine. I think one thing about short stories today, I think there seem to be a few novels coming out where they are novels, but they could also be seen as a series of short stories. And so I think there's this kind of new form of sort of novel short story where the stories are kind of interlinked but separate at the same time. So I think that's something really exciting about the short story currently and today. And yeah, so maybe that would be the sort of the standout thing for me. And you see it in film trends as well. Maybe a few years back with these sort of interlinked stories that all come together. Maybe there's something there about community and what we've been through the past few years with community being fragmented but together. And so I think it's exciting, an exciting form to be working in at the moment.
Great, thank you. Rowan.
Yeah, you know, all writing holds a mirror to the world, and then allows you to change what is seen there. And in this day and age, especially with how much information we interact with all the time online, and how much of it is you know, influenced by the people who write it. In particular now, has always been the case, writing is important, and it allows us to you know, put our verse across so that people can feel less alone and realize that they're not alone in what they're experiencing. But it also allows us to scrutinize truth, and that can come in many forms. And nowadays people have, maybe they are used to interacting with information more quickly than they were in the past, and information can come at them much quicker. So it's easier to access short stories, and they can be posted on Granta and read by thousands and thousands of people very quickly. But people maybe have a shorter attention span in some ways. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but because of the way we interact with information. And so it's a great opportunity, the short story, for people to reflect on their world. And we are living through an unprecedented time. This is an opportunity to reflect on what is now, what is happening, and what has happened, and what might happen, in a way that is digestible, and in a way that can reach people very easily, and maybe have a big effect on them, you know. And this short story competition in particular is one in which you can take risks, because risk taking is obviously rewarded by the 3 short stories that are here. And also one in which you get more space on the page to be able to do so, because most short story competitions have just 2,000 or 3,000 word limits. So be brave, take risks, and short stories can change the world, you know.
Thanks, Rowan. Thank you. Ellen, have you got anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think just in general, the importance of literature as an art form over the last couple of years has been really kind of noticeable for me. It's so comforting being able to sit there with a book or a poem and kind of indulge in a different world. And I think as well about the short story, what I like so much about it is that you can be, as a writer, more experimental. You can kind of try something new that you wouldn't necessarily want to kind of follow through as a whole piece, and that in itself is just a really interesting exercise, and something that I've really loved about it.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. It's been fascinating as always. You know, wish the conversation could go on longer, but I will just hand over to Louise now. We'd be delighted if anybody has any questions they'd like to ask either Megan, Rowan, or Ellen. Yeah, we've got about 10 minutes to have those questions. Over to you, Louise.
Thank you so much, Megan, Ellen, Rowan, and to Lynn for this sharing with us between yourselves of what is clearly sometimes testing and sometimes a very magical writing process, as it created some very magical works. And you've made so clear the particularities of the short story as a form, alongside the generalities of an idea as inspiration. And that comes through very strongly, and the amount of overlap of terrain between all 3 of you has been very fascinating to hear. I'll start ask a very pragmatic one, because I know some of your writing was conducted in the isolation of pandemic lockdown, but you're also have all been at university, which is a notoriously social environment. And I'll just ask whether, as you write, and as you were writing these pieces, or generally as you write, do you tell anybody? Do you talk to anybody about your writing? Do you whisper at all what it is you're writing about? Or do you keep that world completely internal until it bursts forth fully formed onto the page or screen? And I'll start by asking Megan again.
I'm much too much of a chatterbox to not tell anybody about it. Because I know writers who approach it in both ways. But yeah, I talk too much. So I like chatting to my friends and my family about it as I go along, and they're very patient and let me blabber on. I think I probably sort of process things and work things out by talking them through sometimes. And so yeah, chatting about like a character trait that I'm not quite sure how to write it, or something that's tricky, or sometimes just if I'd written a bit and I was really excited, and I might go back upstairs and then realize it was actually quite rubbish what I wrote, but it felt good at the time, and I like sharing that with my close family and friends. Yeah. So
we're going to figure that you do with your rowing mates as well, but probably not when actively underway.
Yeah, interestingly, it's yeah, I don't know whether I think I maybe once when I was writing, or when they were quite close to the end, I mentioned them to my rowing mates. Actually, it was more my housemates and my family that got it as it went along.
Thank you so much. Gosh, very good to know. And Ellen, how about you? Is that your style as well, to chat away about it?
Yeah, so I like to keep my writing quite private, mostly because I like to use my friends and family as proofreaders, and I find it more effective if they have no idea what's happening in the story, and getting those first opinions from them is really valuable. But I also find it quite an isolating thing if you do try to keep it all to yourself. Just the sheer amount of hours that you put into writing a story, it can be really difficult not sharing that. So as much as I try to keep it private, I do end up being a bit of a chatterbox like Megan, and sharing quite a lot as I go through. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And to you, Rowan, what's your style in this?
Similar to Ellen, I'm notoriously private and internal about writing, and especially with short stories, I usually won't say much about them or share anything about it until the end. And I think, like Ellen, when I'm writing, I sort of envision that I'm writing for the same 4 or 5 people who have always been the same 4 or 5 people who read my stories first and who give me comments. And I sometimes will let on that I'm writing something, and maybe the general gist of what it's about, or I'll just say, oh, I think you might enjoy this one, whatever. Or it's kind of like this, but I won't ever usually talk about the details, and I won't usually ever show anyone until the end. And if anyone goes past my screen, I'll sort of cover it up, because it feels like some unfinished thing, and I want in the end for the story itself to say what I want to say, and I don't want to talk about it or let it be seen before it's been finished, because like Megan said earlier, I think the editing process is like maybe the most important part of the whole thing. And yeah, with maybe the exception of my novel, which about halfway through I started talking about and showing a couple of people some small parts and then asking, does this work? Because I wasn't sure about a couple of things. But yeah, internal and private and mysterious.
I'm glad we've had some distinctiveness between you and all that, as your stories were so distinct as well. Before I bring us to a close, with a bit of time for everybody to grab a little bit of lunch before you have to go back to what you're doing, I just check whether there's anybody at all in our audience, perhaps known or unknown to our speakers here, who would like to ask them anything in this forum, or put any comments or make any comment about it. You can either put a message in the chat or raise your hand.
Louise, yeah.
I'm clicking, so going to remain. Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
I don't see any questions appear. I don't see any questions appearing. I don't see any of the people on the screen. We have a question saying, from Jolena, thank you very much. How would you recommend revisiting old pieces of work or old ideas? Ah, what a good question. Ellen, would you like to answer on that? Here. Ellen might be in a tunnel, so Rowan, if you could have a go.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Ellen.
Sorry, Ellen, you go ahead.
I'm nodding along enthusiastically.
All right,
This
Rowan,
is something I've
please.
just done a lot of. So, Ellen, are you there before I go on a ramble?
I can hear you, but I'm not sure if my signal's good enough. So ramble away and then I'll add
Okay.
if there's anything.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And I think it's something I've done a lot of recently. For a long time, I didn't revisit anything. But I think it's now been long enough for me between some of the stories I wrote in the past, about 5 or 6 years. And I've started revisiting things I wrote half a decade ago, because I thought that, so I have become a much better writer in that period. And I revisited a short story and a novella, which I wrote, but wasn't very good at writing at the time of. And I revisited them with much scrutiny, but realized that the gem of the idea and a lot of what was in there, I really liked. And in particular with the short story, what it was about had become interesting to me again. And I'd moved back into a phase where I felt similar to how I felt when I first wrote that. So I went back and took this short story and the novella and chopped them to pieces, basically, and didn't start again. I tried to retain the germ of what was there, and then edited, and tried to bring them forward in terms of, the writing. But then I came up to an important question, which is, should I take away the naivety and some of the, some of where I was at that time in comparison to now, or should I try and retain that? And that's a big question, because, everything you write is, if you will, a timestamp about where you were at the time. And there's something to be said for, the naivety in an 18-year-old or a 20-year-old or a 30-year-old's piece of work in comparison to where they are later. And so I edited this short story and the novella, made the writing much better, made it much clearer, kept a germ of what was in there, but then tried to preserve this worldview I had when I was that age. I think it's a very valuable process, partly just to see, how far you've come, but doing it with much scrutiny and with a large detector of what's not good about it and being ruthless, for me, is the only way to be able to revisit it and try and create something good out of it and polish turds.
Thank you so much, Rowan. As we're out of time, and I can see that Lynn has dropped off our screen, I will wrap up now just with the words that if hearing from last year's 3 winners has inspired anyone else to take up your pen, or probably more accurately, to sit down to your laptop, do check out the details of this year's Oxford BNU Creative Writing Award, which I've just put into the chat and is on our website. Please do join us on the 13th of May online, when Carlos Rojas of Duke University will speak about the creative process in his work of translating some of the world's most eminent authors. And I'll bring this session to a close, thanking our panelists for being as articulate in conversation as you are in the seclusion of your writing. Keep writing, and everyone, please keep well. Thank you so much.